welcome to everyone. This is our first Women in Public Policy Program seminar of the 2020-2021 academic year. The Women in Public Policy Program, or WAP, as we like to call it, equips leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. My name is Dara Cohen, and I am a Ford Foundation Associate Professor of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, and I'm going to be leading the seminar series this fall semester. The series this fall will be devoted to issues of gender, sex, and war, and we have just an incredible slate of 12 speakers who will be joining us in the series this fall, all of whom will be joining us virtually, and many of whom will be calling in from around the world. I want to just start by acknowledging and expressing our appreciation of the generous support provided by Carol Hamilton, who is a Women's Leadership Board member, in making today's programming possible. The Carol Hamilton Gender and Conflict Fund supports a new community here at the Harvard Kennedy School among scholars of gender, conflict, and conflict-related sexual violence. Today, we are just incredibly excited and honored to start our seminar series off with Professor Zoe Marks, who will be presenting her research on inclusive revolutions, why women's participation in mass uprisings creates a rising tide of change. This project, which is carried out by Professor Marks in collaboration with Professor Erica Chenoweth, has been funded by WAP, and 10 Harvard research assistants have also worked with them recently to expand the data set on which the presentation will be based. Professor Marks is a lecturer in public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests focus on African politics, peace building, the intersection of conflict and political violence, and race, gender, and inequality. Her current book project examines the internal dynamics of rebellion in Sierra Leone in order to understand how and why rebel groups can sustain a viable threat to the state without widespread support. That project draws on nearly a decade of fieldwork, including several hundred interviews with former combatants and community members, as well as private archives from members of the Revolutionary United Front. Professor Marks holds a DPhil in politics and a master's in African studies from the University of Oxford, as well as a bachelor's degree in government and African American studies from Georgetown University. I also want to welcome WAP's podcast community, which has downloaded our seminars over 54,000 times. We are so pleased to have a lasting and broad-reaching impact beyond those who are able to attend our virtual seminar today. So the plan for today is that our speaker will present for 30 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions from you, from our virtual audience. We ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of Professor Marks's talk, and then those who have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted in order to ask your question out loud. We do request that any audience questions are very brief and also are on the topic, are posed in the form of a question, and of course are related to our presenters' research. My colleague, Katie Ohnberg, will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar today. Thank you, Katie. And with that, I will turn the floor over to my friend and colleague, Professor Zoe Marks. Thanks again, Zoe, for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. What a privilege to see you all. I noticed I was holding my breath listening to Dara do the introductions because I was so excited to be here. So I've taken a deep breath, and what I'm going to do now is share my screen. Hopefully you all will be able to see some slides. And I'm going to keep my comments to 25 minutes. Katie is going to help me stay to time because I really am looking forward to the discussion and the questions that you bring to our attention when I wrap up this sort of preliminary presentation of a new research project. So this is joint work that I'm doing with Erica Chenoweth, and it's part of a paper that some of you in the class have had a chance to read a draft of, but it's also part of a broader book project. And so there's a lot of descriptive information packed in here today, but what we're really looking at is where and when do women participate in mass uprisings? And more specifically, what happens when women participate at the front lines of mass movements? Does it impact the outcomes in the short term and in the medium term? So here are some very recent images from the summer. You can see women at the front lines of the movement for justice for Breonna Taylor, part of the broader movement for Black lives in America. Down in the bottom, you can see what was called the Wall of Moms mobilizing in Portland, Oregon, where they were standing up, protesting in support of the movement for Black lives and also demanding that the federal troops leave Portland, Oregon. But this is part of a much longer legacy of women both making disruptive change and fighting for political transformation and democracy and fighting for their rights, but also on the other hand, being written out of history. So here you can see Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement, being kind of forcefully arrested in London in the early 1900s. Here's one of the movements that had the largest levels of women's frontline participation out of any contemporary nonviolent movement, the People Power movement in the Philippines. Here's again an image of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement when it first started in 2015. And more recently, a grandmother who was telling the riot police in Algiers and Algeria what she thought about their occupation of the city and their policing of protest. And also last year, protesters in Beirut, which has seen long and protracted cycles of mass uprisings. But we're also looking in this project at women who have borne arms as part of their revolutionary struggle. And so here's a fighter from the Eritrean People's Liberation Front in Eritrea, part of the Horn of Africa. Here's a female fighter from the FARC in Colombia. And what we're motivated by in this study is this observation that has come out of a lot of recent feminist research and conflict studies, that there are often feminist gains after conflict, that women's rights are sometimes increased. We sometimes see improvements in gender equality after war. And some of this has been traced to the incorporation of women into the war machine. So you might think of Rosie the Riveter and how that led to kind of expanded opportunities for women in the labor force in the United States after World War II. But we've also seen that some of these gains have been difficult to consolidate. So Marie Berry has done research on Bosnia and Rwanda, where she's found that women were really powerful players in the peace process, but then ultimately have been sort of pushed to the side in formal politics in the years that followed. And we've seen that in a number of different contexts. And so what Erica and I set out to do was to collect data that looks at what happens when women participate in these movements, both in the short term, in terms of their immediate success, and in the medium term, so 5 years after the conflict ends. And this is part of a broader agenda that's often called the Gender, Peace, and Security Agenda, or the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. And this is about 20 years old. This is the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So those of you who are in Professor Cohen's class will be talking about this a lot, and those of you who are part of the broader WAP community may have heard of 1325. It's the first of a suite of Security Council resolutions that aim to actually reintroduce the identification and analysis of women's role in conflict and in peace into the broader international agenda that happens when war is breaking out and also when the international community is trying to end violent conflict. And so the research that's happened in the past 20 years, which my work, Professor Cohen's work, my colleague Erica's work has been part of, has mostly focused on a few kind of key areas that relate to violent conflict. So we've seen a lot of research that looks at women's participation in rebel groups. There's been work that identifies that women are often participating in insurgency, even though in the mind's eye and in the news, we might tend to think of insurgents as men. This does, however, tend to overlook some of the other transgressive forms of contentious politics that the project I'm talking about today looks at. And so part of what we're trying to do with today's research is actually alongside rebel groups, which are the sort of paradigmatic revolutionary actors, we want to look at all these other forms of political and popular protest that might mobilize instead of formal armed rebellion. Another pillar in the women, peace, and security research space is looking at women's participation in formal political institutions. So here we might think about quotas to ensure that women are represented in elected office. We might think about peace processes and whether or not there are women at the table, whether or not there are women mediators. The numbers have been low, and this UN Security Council resolution is designed to increase those numbers. So research has played an important role in identifying the gaps in women's formal participation in politics, particularly around peace and conflict. However, this also tends to miss informal mobilization. So we know that where women have been excluded from formal power, they have often been included in women's movements, in women's organizations, sometimes in religious spaces, and other forms of civic action and political action where women have found ways, maybe against the odds and in the face of patriarchal politics, to make their voices heard. And the last kind of key theme in this women, peace, and security research that already exists is looking at this idea of women's empowerment after war that I just introduced as sort of one of the motivations for this study. And here we tend to focus on what happens after conflict, but we don't tend to look at it in comparison to other national crises. And so that includes mass nonviolent uprisings. We might think that the disruption caused by violent conflict could create openings for gender equality or for gains in democracy. But what we're interested in doing in this study is looking at whether it might also relate to some of the gains that could happen after nonviolent conflicts that are similar mass uprisings that cause kind of political crises and change of a similar scale to some of what is observed during violent conflict. So our contribution builds on that women, peace, and security literature, and it also seeks to build on some of the social movements literature, which historically has focused on looking at women's action in political protest for women's issues. So there's this idea that when women are political actors, they're being sort of feminist political actors, women mobilize for women. And this tends to overlook the fact that a lot of what women do in politics is mobilize for broad-based national issues. They mobilize for their families, for the economy, for jobs, for democracy, for political change. And the other thing that this literature has tended to look at is actually the backlash rather than the empowerment. So there are some interesting kind of opportunities that we hope to kind of build upon in the existing literature. And where we think we're making a contribution with this paper and would welcome your sort of feedback for how to improve it is by both comparing violent and nonviolent mass mobilizations to see what the difference is when large groups of people organize a campaign using violent tactics or using nonviolent tactics, but on both instances trying to mobilize to overthrow the government or to secede and gain political independence. So we're looking at maximal campaigns, campaigns that are aimed at the highest level of political change. We're also interested in looking at women mobilizing as people and not just as women. So we're not just interested in the gender dynamics, although that becomes part of the story, as I'll explain in just a moment. And then we're looking at the campaign as either exclusive of women, so that men are overrepresented because women are being discriminated against or excluded from movements and political spaces, or inclusive, that women are able to participate fully in a campaign on its path towards changing outcomes in a country. So our two research questions that I'm going to present the new data on are this. The first is, does women's participation at the front lines of mass mobilization increase violent and nonviolent movements' chances of success? And you might expect that there could be variation on this according to the tactics of violence or nonviolence, but does it increase the likelihood of success when women participate? And the second question is, does women's participation lead to more inclusive outcomes more generally? So not only in the immediate aftermath of a campaign, but also 5 years on, does it lead to democracy, and does it enhance women's empowerment when women participate in both violent and nonviolent campaigns? And another way of thinking about this question is, what are the costs when mass campaigns exclude women and make it a male-dominated campaign? What are the implications for campaign success? And so we're currently in the process of expanding our data up until 2019. I see that we have a few of our esteemed and totally fabulous RAs in the room. So I want to give a special shout out to Abby, Diane, and Rose, who I saw come in earlier. Apologies if I'm missing anyone else. We've worked with about 10 students over the summer during COVID to try to update the data set, but the data I'm presenting today go from 1945 to 2014. That includes 338 nonviolent and violent maximalist campaigns. These are campaigns seeking to overthrow the government or secede and gain sovereignty for a new independent state. And they're about split, almost half and half, between violent and nonviolent. So they're almost equal numbers of violent and nonviolent campaigns in this data set. And then we include a number of other different measures, including the peak participation size that the campaign reached, the success or failure of the immediate outcomes. And this is something we could talk more about, but we're really looking at, did they achieve that maximalist objective? Not the sort of more nuanced definitions of success, which might look at, were there some reforms? Was there some capitulation? We're really trying to use a kind of hard standard of, were they able to achieve their ultimate aim? And then we look at frontline women's participation, women's leadership in these campaigns, whether the campaign was explicitly gender inclusive, and also did the campaign feature women's issues? Because we suspect that some of these things might have an impact on whether women participate. Now, for our dependent variable, we're using what's called the Varieties of Democracy data set. And this is a terrific data set that uses lots of different measures to look at both index variables of democracy and women's empowerment, but then also it provides kind of a breakdown of those variables, which I'll talk about when we get to that part of the presentation. And then in terms of the design, this is a cross-sectional regression analysis. So we have various dependent variables. All of the models are sort of specified according to the DV. If anyone's interested in the kind of nuts and bolts of this, I'm happy to send you the paper. Just send me a message or an email after the talk. But the control variables have been informed by some of that research that I mentioned before. And we have robust standard errors that are clustered around the location to account for some of the variation we see at the country level. So I want to focus here just on the participation data to give you a flavor of what our data looks like. We focus on different kinds of women's participation. Frontline participation is whether or not women are observed out in the streets in protests or in battles in violent conflicts. We then look at support roles, and there's huge numbers of campaigns with women's support. It's almost impossible to find campaigns. It's not impossible, but it's almost impossible to find campaigns where women don't play some sort of supporting role. We look at women's leadership in the campaigns. We look at whether they provide a symbolic or rhetorical level of support. So that's whether they're out speaking on behalf of the campaign, and then whether women are figureheads, whether there's a sort of prominent female iconography associated with campaigns. And in terms of the frontline variable, which is where I'll focus our time today, we look at extent, and we have a few campaigns where women are not observed participating in frontline roles at all. There's another category that looks at limited participation, so less than 25% of participants are women. Moderate participation is 25 to 50%, and extensive participation means at least half or more of the participants that are observed are women. So what do we find in these 338 campaigns that we have in the data set at present? We find that 89%, almost 90% of all campaigns include women at the front lines. That's across all categories, which is a huge number of women's representation at the front lines of these mass movements. So that when you think about how history's been written, this is some of what's been excluded, all of these women at the front lines. More importantly, all but one nonviolent campaign included frontline women. There was slightly lower numbers in terms of violent campaigns. 76% or 3/4 included frontline women. And this is almost twice what we found in previous research. So we're really excited to dig more into some of these descriptive findings, because just being able to identify this many campaigns that have women observed at the front lines is new information for the women, peace, and security agenda. But more importantly, nonviolent campaigns also have significantly higher levels of women's participation. So those statistics I just gave you were for any women. But when you look at sort of moderate or extensive participation, that's almost entirely based in the nonviolent campaigns. And in the past decade, we've seen 70% of nonviolent campaigns have these higher levels, 25% or more of female participants at the front lines. So what you're looking at on this graph is, you can see across the x-axis is the time from 1945 up to 2015. And across the y-axis gives you a sense of what the level or scale of women's participation is according to our coding criteria. And the x's represent the violent campaigns. Almost all of the campaigns, all but one of the campaigns that excluded women entirely, were violent campaigns. Comparatively, all of the extensive women's participation was observed in the nonviolent campaigns. I'm going to show you another way to visualize this, which gives you another sense of some of this temporal variation. So the way that it has varied over time. You can see in the 1970s and 80s, there was this sort of heyday of women's participation, largely in Marxist or Leninist armed groups. So the orange bars are the violent conflicts, and the blue bars represent the nonviolent mass campaigns. And we've seen that those have both been increasing and the level of women's participation has been increasing. And so this gives you a good sense of just where the women are in these mass maximalist campaigns, that you're much more likely to observe moderate and extensive women's participation if you're looking at a nonviolent mass movement rather than a violent mass movement. There are 4 or 5 hypotheses that I'll present today, depending on how you count. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, leaving time for questions. The first is that we hypothesize that higher proportions of women's participation will be associated with increased campaign size. All things being equal, if you see women participating, that's going to increase the size of the campaign. We then hypothesize that higher proportions of women's participation, not only in addition to increasing the size, they'll also increase the success. So this is the winning team hypothesis. We think women are half the sky, so you include them, the campaign will be larger. Second hypothesis, larger campaigns with women's participation are more likely to succeed. And then we look at those sort of slightly medium-term outcomes. So looking at 5 years on after the campaign has ended, we hypothesize that there's a rising tide, that women's participation in mass movements is more likely to lead to egalitarian democracy 5 years after the campaign ends, all things being equal. And we also think that there might be empowerment effects, that when women participate in these mass movements, whether violent or nonviolent, their participation in the campaign is going to kind of claim political space. And so you should see a higher degree of women's empowerment 5 years after the campaign ends. Now, our last hypothesis is the inverse of that fourth hypothesis. And this looks at that backlash problem that some of the other research has identified. So we've seen in existing literature both evidence for women's empowerment after war. We don't know what happens after nonviolent conflict. So that's one of the innovations here, is bringing them together. We've also seen evidence of backlash. And so we wanted to look at, when is empowerment happening, or is backlash more likely? Because women participated, should we instead see heightened gender inequities after women's participation in violent or nonviolent mass campaigns? So looking at the first hypothesis, we find that inclusive campaigns with women, men, all genders participating are much larger than gender exclusive campaigns. So this is statistically significant and sizable. There's a strong positive correlation. As women's participation in campaigns goes up, so does the peak campaign size, the largest size observed in a campaign. But we don't know, because this is a correlation and not necessarily causal, we don't know for sure until more research is done whether larger movements attract more women, or as women participate, they mobilize larger numbers of people. That as people see women in the streets, they feel that that's something that they want to be a part of or feel safe being part of. So we need to unravel that a little bit more. The second hypothesis, women make the winning team. Here we find that as campaign size increases, we interact that with women's participation, and it strongly predicts success. So there's a slight drop off in the number of observations because we need to be able to estimate both the peak campaign size and women's participation levels for this variable. We control for things like women's issues, the gender ideology, whether women are observed calling for peace, which we might think would insulate the safety of participation, whether state violence is observed. These are all control variables that have been theorized in previous research as potentially impacting women's participation. So we control for them in order to hold them constant, and we still find that nonviolent campaigns with extensive women's participation have almost perfect predicted success. So the larger the campaign becomes, if it's nonviolent with women participating, the higher the likelihood of it having that sort of high level immediate success. But we find that exclusive campaigns, so campaigns that exclude women and are almost entirely male dominated, they're very unlikely to succeed, even if they're large. So I'll give you a graph that models the estimated probability, right? So this is the predicted probability of hypothetical campaigns, not the actual observed campaigns, but using the model, what we find is that on the blue line at the bottom, if you have no frontline women's participation, you can have up to 1 million participants, and your predicted probability of success is nearly 0. Conversely, if you have extensive women's participation, you actually don't need to have as large of a peak campaign size in order to have a high likelihood of campaign success. So this gives you a sense of just how important women are, not only in increasing the numbers in a campaign, but actually their presence in that campaign makes the campaign more likely to succeed. And we're still working through the mechanisms, but we think this is a really exciting finding that there's some sort of existing evidence and theoretical work, particularly in qualitative research, that might explain this dynamic. Why are women such a kind of crucial ingredient along with campaign size for success? And the first and most obvious is that if you include half the sky, if you include women, then you've automatically sort of doubled the recruitable base for your campaign, whether violent or non-violent. You want to be able to recruit as many supporters as possible and to have them at the front line showing that they're supporting the movement, not just in the background, but publicly. This public visibility that women can have in these campaigns might then enhance mobilization. So it encourages other people to join, and it diversifies pathways for people to participate. So one of the things we often pick up as you look at the sort of historical narrative and qualitative evidence in this research area is that as women participate, they're much more likely to tell their friends and family members and other people in the community that they're participating. And so that can diversify pathways to entry into a campaign. Again, whether violent or non-violent, you always want as diverse of a recruitment base, not only just to maximize how many people you can tap into, but the different ways that information might diffuse about the campaign. There's some evidence that women also signal legitimacy, that when women participate, it makes the campaign seem more universal, more benevolent, more democratic, more inclusive. It may be the case that women's participation signals that this is a campaign that is safe to join, or that some of the more vulnerable members of society are willing to risk everything in order to join it, which is part of that kind of legitimacy agenda. And this can also suggest that the campaign's more likely to succeed. When people observe participants from all walks of life, they may think, oh wow, that campaign has really gotten out a lot of successful supporters. Maybe they've already developed a sort of quorum in society and they're gonna win. And what this might do for nonviolent campaigns is it may increase a couple of factors that are really important for the success of nonviolent campaigns. So now, leaving aside violent campaigns, we know that nonviolent movements rely very much on defections from people in power. So people in power may be slightly more likely to defect when they see large numbers of women, grandmothers, mothers, people outside of the sort of normal base of activated political men in patriarchal societies. So that's one way that gender inclusive movements might increase defections from those in power. And they may also help maintain nonviolent discipline. That we've also seen that sometimes women can play a critical role in shaping the movement's ability to kind of maintain its cohesion and discipline to be nonviolent. And then finally, one of the things that we're beginning to build a new data set around is looking at women's ability to innovate tactics. And I think this is really exciting because it works through different pathways for violent and nonviolent campaigns, but we know that women historically have played pivotal roles in animating and activating boycotts for centuries, sit-ins, strikes, and that women sometimes have socially contextual knowledge about where the sort of Achilles heel is in an economy or in a power structure. We also think that women might increase the cultural expressions that are available to a movement. This is part of how the movement shapes its public narrative. They can use different forms of art, nudity, and song that have different cultural resonance than if they were done exclusively by men. And particularly in armed conflicts, we know that women are sometimes more effective spies, they're more effective messengers, and they can be more effective for some of the other forms of movement because they're not necessarily securitized in the same way that male bodies are. So these are just some of the factors that we think help influence not just the campaign size explaining success, but actually the composition is really essential for success. So I've only got a few more minutes. I want to move quickly through the rising tide. The rising tide is this argument that as women participate in these mass movements, after they end, everyone benefits. And what we see is that nonviolent campaigns have a significant positive correlation with increased democracy. So you're much more likely to have democracy 5 years after the campaign is over if it's nonviolent. Violent campaigns, there's not really a strong, significant relationship with democratic inroads, which is perhaps not terribly surprising. But we also see that women's participation does make an added impact on the substantive significant increase in democratic gains. So the more women participate at the front lines, the higher the predicted democracy index, especially if you compare it with no women being observed at the front lines. Now there's a big caveat here, which is that these democratic gains that happen after mass movements are conditional on the movement succeeding. When nonviolent campaigns fail with extensive women's participation, there's often an authoritarian backlash. So what you're looking at here is nonviolent campaigns on the left and violent campaigns on the right. And you're not looking at change over time on the x-axis, but rather the level of women's participation. So as I said, we don't have any violent campaigns with extensive frontline women's participation. So the x-axis only goes to 2. On the left-hand side, you can see it goes all the way to 3. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the increase in the egalitarian democracy that that country experiences 5 years after a campaign ends, compared to the year before the campaign began. So you'll see, particularly looking at the nonviolent campaign lines, that the successful campaigns in red incrementally increase the level of egalitarian democracy, almost 0.2 on a scale of 0 to 1. Comparatively, the failed campaigns have a dramatic backlash. They're much less democratic if there are large levels of women's participation. And so we argue that this observes an authoritarian backlash that is then echoed in what happens with gender empowerment or exclusion specifically. So the empowerment and backlash hypotheses looked at whether this women's participation at the front lines creates gains for women more generally, whether it generates gender equality in society. And we see that there's actually, in this one, a relatively similar increase in gender equity after violent and nonviolent campaigns alike, which is pretty surprising. You might expect that violent campaigns don't lead to gender equity, but we see that there's relatively similar pattern here, and that higher levels of women's frontline participation does lead to modest gains in gender empowerment scores for the countries where the campaign happened. But again, this is conditional on success. So we see that there's a significant predicted backslide in women's empowerment scores where campaigns fail. And you don't see it on the right-hand side where you can look at the violent campaigns. Violent campaigns are not statistically significantly different. They're relatively stable. Women's empowerment doesn't change a lot depending on whether or not women participated in large numbers after conflict. But in nonviolent campaigns, you can see that there is a relatively strong prediction of a backslide in women's empowerment when the campaign fails. And that is mostly observed with the largest levels of women's participation. So there are similar trends observed if you look at the components of empowerment. We've also looked at women's civil liberties. We've looked at women's formal political representation, and we've looked at women's civil society involvement. So some of those other factors I said have sometimes been left out of the debates. We've looked at each of those and we've seen similar trends that when campaigns succeed, all of those factors improve in society 5 years after the campaign ends. But when a campaign fails with larger women's participation, you're more likely to observe larger patriarchal and authoritarian backlash. And right now we're working through some of these mechanisms, but quite simply, we think that women's participation in mass movements is one of the primary drivers and the most overlooked conditions for democratization that countries have gone through and for the increased equity that women have helped to secure. We think this is because power concedes nothing without a demand, and that when women exercise their demands for democracy and for equal rights, whether through violent or nonviolent mobilization, it leads to that rising tide for all boats. So in summary, women are more likely to increase the size of a campaign, they're more likely to increase the success, but democracy and gender equity are entirely conditional on success, and backlash tends to follow when campaigns fail. So I want to just conclude with an image of Ala Saleh, who is one of the iconic spokespeople out on the street. She was just a participant in the Sudan People's Movement that was successful. But you can see that her participation, which led to this viral image that then led to street art and continued to mobilize and catalyze support for democracy and democratic transition in Sudan, also translated to her being included and invited to speak at the UN. So you can see the same woman on the lower left-hand corner speaking in front of the United Nations. And this is where I think the international community has a role to play in supporting and consolidating not only gains for democracy, but also gains for women's rights and gender equity and egalitarian principles more broadly. That if you don't support the nonviolent movements, whether they have succeeded or failed, we have to consolidate what women's participation has called for in these campaigns, because winning has thus far been crucial to the opportunities for gender equity, but it has not necessarily guaranteed gender equitable transformation or democratic transformation in the aftermath. And with that, I will look forward to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Marks. That was such a fascinating talk and such an important and timely topic.